Hi YouTube, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're having a great week so far. This one for me has been a lot more chilled than in recent weeks, which is a welcome relief. Sometimes you just need like boring and predictable life to feel calm. And that's very much where I'm at right now, which is a nice feeling. This week's been pretty work heavy, good training, and generally just a little more focused on health, which is great. So today I'm going to be doing a question and answer episode, and I asked you guys on my Instagram page to send me your questions that you wanted me to answer in a bit more depth. So I want to kick things off with a really good question around how often should and can you change around movements within your training program? So when we think about the goal being to build muscle, we definitely don't want to be hopping between random programs. I think this narrative is dying out a little bit now, which is definitely a good thing, that your muscles in some way need to be surprised or shocked in order to get them to grow. In fact, muscles really like repetition, particularly when we're looking to get stronger. So as a rule of thumb, you want to really be sticking with something for a minimum of 4 weeks so that we have time to really practice those movements, find our strength limits, and then aim to progress over time. The first couple of weeks of any new training program, really regardless of how experienced you are, is going to be focused around baselining, figuring out where my technique is, what I need to tighten up, and where my current strength limits actually sit. You're probably going to be dealing with a bit more soreness, and generally it's going to be a bit harder to recover because you're not used to doing these particular movements in this particular order. So we really need to give some time for you to bed those movements in and get used to that new structure. And then really on the other end of the scale, there's only kind of 2 reasons why you ever need to change the training that you're doing. The first one is, frankly, you get bored. As much as we do need to build a bit of resilience around mastering those mundane, fundamental exercises, there's going to come a time at some point where you're just thinking, I could really do with switching things up a little bit. That mental fatigue is going to be a barrier for you getting to the gym consistently. So we definitely want to keep an eye on that. If kind of 12 weeks into a program, you're thinking, I cannot face doing this particular leg day again, then it's probably a good sign that you're ready to switch things up. The second reason, and this happens less often than you think, is that you cannot progress anymore in the movements that you're doing. Now, this only really applies if you're more of an intermediate lifter. In that beginner stage, you will likely find that you're jumping up the weights almost week on week. And that isn't necessarily because you've gained loads of muscle. There's definitely an element of that, but it's more likely that you're just figuring out where your actual limits are. Figuring out your version of hard and learning how to train with the right kind of intensity, that close proximity to failure. So again, let's use 12 weeks as an example. You've been following the same plan and you just feel like you cannot squeeze out another rep. You cannot add another kilo to your working sets. And maybe your recovery is also starting to suffer. Your general training quality is starting to suffer. Again, it's probably a good sign that it's time to change things slightly. And then when it comes to changing a program, you do not need to reinvent the wheel every single time you go for a training program update. It might just be that you change the order around slightly. You change the variation of squat that you're doing, for example. Maybe you add a pause at the bottom. Maybe you slow down the tempo in the eccentric. It doesn't need to be a completely new training plan with new exercises that you've never done before. Oftentimes, just a few tweaks are needed to keep you moving forward. In my experience, I would say somewhere between 4 weeks on the lower end of the scale and 12-ish weeks on the upper end of the scale is usually the sweet spot for most people. We then have a question about how you know whether you're building muscle and whether you can track it. First thing to mention is that muscle growth is slow, like painfully slow. So unless you've only just started training, think months and even years, not weeks. With muscle growth, the most obvious one, in my view, is progress pictures. So I'd recommend you take these every couple of weeks, even once a month, so that you can physically see the muscle that you're building. And again, when we're thinking about how to take these progress pictures, we want to be trying to keep most of the factors the same each time. So think about the lighting, the direction of the lighting, ideally natural lighting coming in towards you. Wear the same clothes when you're taking progress pictures, again, so that everything is as comparable as possible. And also think about how you're standing and what kind of pose you're doing to take these pictures. So if I'm just stood like this pretty naturally, you might not be able to see a lot of my muscle mass. But if I was to flex, you can see the muscles that you're trying to build. Again, trying to keep those poses the same, super consistent each time, really does show you tangibly in black and white what progress you're making when it comes to muscle mass. Another one that I think is maybe overlooked but is quite an obvious one is if you are getting stronger over time and you can lift something now that you categorically could not lift 6 weeks ago, then it's safe to say there is more muscle on your frame at this point. Now, this doesn't necessarily apply to those people who are brand new to lifting, because again, you're probably just figuring out where those strength limits truly lie, and seeing like 20, 30 kilo increases on some of your big lifts in the space of a few weeks is not a realistic expectation of how quickly you can assume you'll build muscle. But if you are in that more intermediate camp, maybe you've been lifting for 2 years or more, you're consistent with that, you stick to a structured training program, and all other factors are the same, as in your energy levels, recovery, all of that sort of stuff is relatively similar compared to your previous attempt at that lift. If you can now do it, whereas you could not before, that is a sign that you are growing muscle. The principle of progressive overload means you add load or add demand to your lifts as much as you possibly can. That elicits muscle growth. But it's also useful to look at progressive overload through the lens of, I can now only physically lift this weight because of the muscle that I have built. So taking progress pictures and making sure your lifts are tracking up over time are the two main ways that I would suggest you track your muscle growth. There are also some ways that I would advise you against when it comes to tracking that progress. Scale weight being one of them, particularly if you're going through a journey of body recomposition, i.e. you're losing body fat and you're gaining muscle mass at the same time. It's likely that you're going to be losing fat quicker than you're building muscle, so we would still expect that trend to be going downwards, but it's probably not as steep as you may expect it to be if the goal is muscle growth concurrently with that fat loss. Because unsurprisingly, muscle weighs something. So the scales can be a little bit confusing and misleading in the pursuit of body recomposition. I also wouldn't recommend using one of those scales that tells you how much body fat or how much muscle mass you have or don't have. They are fairly inaccurate. And whilst it might be helpful to look at that data over time to see what direction it's trending in, they can vary pretty wildly from day to day. So again, can cause a little bit of extra confusion if you see that yesterday, apparently you had a kilo more of muscle mass than you do today. There are also very useful tools such as DEXA scans that you can go through to see your levels of body composition, but I appreciate most people don't have one of those lying around. So progress pictures and tracking your lifts are a yes, bathroom scales and body weight are a no. We have a question on glute growth. So what are the best exercises and how often do you need to train those exercises for glute growth? To start with a caveat, everyone is going to be different, okay? So your propensity to build muscle mass is something that is pretty variable from person to person. A lot of it is down to genetics. Also, when we think about size and volume of glutes, again, a lot of that's going to be down to where you carry your body fat naturally. So if you're someone a bit like me who's quite straight, quite narrow in terms of my baseline structure, it's going to be more difficult to grow kind of big, voluptuous glutes. Whereas if you're someone who holds most of your body fat proportionately in your lower body, it may be slightly easier, alongside structured training, of course, to see that glute development. So with that caveat out of the way, what are the overarching principles? For glute growth and any muscle growth, you're going to want to train the muscle group at hand through their various functions and through a full range of motion. So when we think about glutes specifically, their functions within your body is hip extension, abduction, and rotation. So I'm going to run through the exercises that match that function because that's essentially what we're aiming to do. So when we think about the glute max, that's the biggest muscle of all three. This is the one responsible for that hip extension that I mentioned. And when we think about hip extension, there are various ways in which we can do this. We're going to split these into two camps. One where the glutes are lengthened and stretched, and the other where the glutes are shortened and contracted. You want to train both. So when we're thinking about that lengthened movement, we're thinking about any kind of squat variation, a lunge variation, a hinge variation. Then that shortened and contracted position. Sorry guys, you may have noticed a couple of changes to my appearance. We had a brief interlude. Life happened. Had to take a break, got distracted. Anyway, we're back. So when we're thinking about that shortened and contracted position, really here we're thinking about any kind of hip thrust or bridge, a 45-degree hip extension, and any kind of kickback. So we definitely want to train the glutes across the lengthened and the shortened position when we're thinking about optimizing our training for muscle growth. We then have the other function of the glutes, which is really where the glute medius and glute minimus come in, kind of the upper outer glutes. They're a much smaller muscle group, and what they do is take the leg away from the midline of the body. And this is called abduction, abduction. You can do this type of movement with a machine, with a cable, or even just body weight. So we've got hip extension, both lengthened and shortened, and abduction. We want to really cover all of those bases. And when it comes down to what movements you choose from all of these camps, really it's going to be down to your personal preference and what feels good for your structure. You do not have to do any particular exercise in order to grow your glutes, but you do need to tick those boxes. So I would suggest choosing 2 or 3 from each of those camps that you want to focus on getting super strong at. And when we think about volume for glutes, there's a couple of things you want to bear in mind. Total volume, we're probably looking anywhere north of 10 working sets per muscle group per week. There's definitely a point where you get kind of a reducing return on investment. But if you're training 3 to 4 times a week, it's unlikely you're going to reach that. In my experience, it can work really well to train glutes 2 to 3 times a week. You can split that volume up however you like. Again, the caveat being, these have got to be hard sets, close to failure. Something else to watch out for when you are training glutes, if you choose that 3 times a week option, you probably want to bias more shortened, contracted type movements rather than those lengthened, stretched ones. This is because when we think about things like squats, lunges, Romanian deadlifts, they're all quite taxing on the glutes and take a little bit longer to recover from. You can generally handle a little bit more volume when it comes to those shortened position movements. And then the final thing on this question is just because it's more, that doesn't mean it's better. So we can definitely fall into the trap, particularly when you're looking at, say, Instagram videos of glute workouts, of redundant exercises. And what I mean by that is you're basically training the same movement pattern with the same muscle position over and over and over again. An example of this could be something like a barbell squat, followed by reverse lunges, followed by a Bulgarian split squat, followed by a step up. They are all squatting or lunging patterns in the lengthened, stretched position. And it's pretty unlikely that you're going to get all of that volume to actually be effective for muscle growth. Well-rounded glute day, in my opinion, you're better off going for a squat, a hinge, a thrust, and an abduction. 4 movements, 2 to 3 working sets of each movement, and then you're covering all of those bases, minimum effective dose in terms of volume, relatively easy to recover from, and you're getting those key boxes ticked of lengthened, shortened, hip extension, hip abduction. I actually have a podcast episode on this exact topic, training for glute growth and how to perfect it. So if you want that, drop the word glutes in the comments. And then the final question is around whether fat loss is realistic during a busy social summer. So to answer this really simply, yes, it is realistic. But the thing that's probably needing some adjustment are your expectations. Just objectively, if you were to look ahead and see you've got 3 months, barely any social plans, life is very predictable, life is very steady, you're eating at home most of the time, compared with a summer of fun, holidays, weddings, barbecues, parties, the quiet, calm 3-month period is clearly going to be much easier when it comes to that fat loss efficiency. The more you can predict, the more you can plan, the better you're able to execute. However, as I say, it is not unrealistic to have a fat loss goal during summer and be successful at that. You may just need to accept that the rate may be a little bit slower. Without context on exactly what's happening during your summer, I can give some kind of overarching principles around what I would do if I had a fat loss goal and also a social calendar that was looking very full. So firstly, I would be picking out the things that I know are top of the priority list for me in terms of I want to really have fun and enjoy that moment. So that might be your best friend's wedding, a holiday of a lifetime. You've got a family member coming over that you haven't seen for years. Those things are clearly going to rate pretty highly on that priority scale. And as a result, we can absolutely knock our fat loss priority down that scale. I wouldn't recommend tracking on your best friend's wedding day or weighing out your food to meet your family member when you're going out for dinner. It's not realistic. Not only is it not realistic, but you're not a professional bodybuilder, and this is just not that serious. And reinforcing the idea that fat loss needs to come above and beyond every other thing in your life is likely to do some damage to your relationship with food and exercise. So you've prioritized the big ones, the ones where, frankly, fat loss doesn't matter. The rest, we can absolutely employ some simple strategies to help you navigate that. So before whatever your event is, it's worth having a bit of a think about how you're going to approach it. Are you going to track it? Can you track it? Can you check the menu beforehand? Can you give yourself an alcohol limit? All of these sorts of questions are worth answering ahead of time. Have a look at the menu. Choose something that is based around protein. Maybe you can swap around some of the sides that it comes with. Maybe you could ask your friend if you want to share a portion of chips. Could you order a side of broccoli or salad to bulk that out and give it some volume and fiber? Any sauces or dressings you could just ask to have on the side so that you can use as little or as much as you like. And also, don't be afraid of the doggy bag. I am a huge fan of taking food home with me that I do not finish at the time. And if it doubles up for lunch the next day, then it's a win-win. I guess the other thing I'd say on that is you do not have to explain to anyone why you are doing what you're doing. Your goals are personal to you, and you should absolutely not feel any guilt or shame around putting some boundaries in place for the thing that's important to you, which at the time may well be fat loss. So if you don't want that second bottle of wine, but your friend does, it's okay to say no. I guess the overarching point on this question is that you are a product, or your results are a product, of what you do most of the time. Let's say you have some sort of social plan every weekend up until September. I would consider that a pretty busy social calendar. There are still 6 other days of the week that are completely in your control. Any sort of physique change takes time. Weeks and months, not days. So remind yourself of that the next time you're caught thinking that one day out is going to ruin everything. And that is it for today, guys. Before I swelter in this heat, I need to open a window. If you don't already follow me on Instagram, I'll drop my profile in the caption. I am yapping on there on a daily basis about all of this sort of stuff. So if you want to see more content, I'd suggest you give me a follow. Remember to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Love you, bye.